This is ILTV On The Hour. We're live in Israel, bringing you the biggest headlines from the region. It's currently 2 p.m. here in Israel and 7 a.m. in New York. I'm Shosh Bedrosian, and today is day 688 of the war in Gaza. Let's get into all the top headlines at this hour. It's day 688 of this war, as we said, and the IDF offensive is pressing forward. Israeli tanks have pushed deeper into Gaza City. Social media footage shows armored vehicles operating in the Sabra neighborhood, just next to Zaytun, where the IDF has been fighting for days. The advancement is part of what commanders call the preliminary stage of a wider plan to capture Gaza City. Tens of thousands of reservists are set to report for duty starting on September 2nd, a buildup expected to lead into the major offensive in the enclave. Guided by intelligence from Shin Bet and the IDF, troops continue to operate across the Gaza Strip. And a fallen soldier happened amid the fighting. The army announced the death of a 20-year-old Lieutenant Ori Gerlich from Meitar. He was killed in an apparent accidental explosion in southern Gaza. The incident is under investigation. Absolutely devastating. The news came after Shabbat. And Netanyahu approves hostage talks and a Gaza war plan. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says he has authorized negotiators to attend talks on securing the release of all hostages, even as he approved plans for the military assault on Gaza City. In a video statement recorded outside Gaza Division headquarters, Netanyahu touted the upcoming operation while also ordering his team to engage in new negotiations. But he has still not said whether he supports the ceasefire deal backed by Hamas, which was accepted last week. Critics warn that a full-scale offensive could undermine the 60-day ceasefire mediators are trying to finalize. Take a listen to what the Prime Minister had to say.
אני הגעתי היום לאוגדת עזה כדי לאשר את התוכניות שצה"ל הציג בפניי לשר הביטחון להשתלטות על העיר עזה ולהכרעת החמאס. אני מאוד מעריך את ההתייצבות של חיילי המילואים וכמובן של הצבא הסדיר למען המטרה החיונית הזאת. במקביל אני הנחיתי להתחיל במשא ומתן מיידי על שחרור כל חטופינו וסיום המלחמה בתנאים שמקובלים על ישראל.
Israel corrects Trump's claim on hostages. The Israeli government has disputed this claim that President Trump said fewer than 20 hostages remain alive in Gaza at this point in time. We do know, according to brand new reports that have been released this morning, there are apparently 2 hostages in life-threatening conditions at this point in time. Now, the comment that Trump made during on Friday to journalists in the Oval Office sparked outrage and demands for clarification from hostage families. Israel's hostage coordinator Gal Hirsch said there has been no change in the known number of living hostages at this point in time in the war. Trump also took credit for previous hostage releases, saying his support and helped get so many people out of captivity. And joining us now to discuss is Calev Ben David, anchor for ILTV's Security Brief. Thanks so much for being with us today, Calev. Let's talk about just these discrepancies that we're hearing. President Trump made these comments on Friday in the Oval Office to journalists, basically saying that there's less than 20 hostages that could be alive at this point in time, but Israel has not been able to confirm that number. And actually, we know an official told the families of hostages that they have no update and no status on what Trump was saying. What could be the reason for something like this?
Sure. Well, first of all, it's obvious there are some hostages in life-threatening conditions. We know that just from the hostage videos that were released recently. But it's very interesting. President Trump in recent weeks didn't focus on the hostages. He hasn't mentioned the hostages much. He actually has he turned his focus more towards moving ahead with the Gaza operation and saying that Israel needs to go in, finish the job, defeat hostages. Now he's talking about the hostages. Maybe no coincidence as negotiations are starting to pick up, that his focus may be shifting, at least President Trump's focus may be shifting to getting a hostage deal. And I think it was very important. There was some very interesting reporting over the weekend about discussions in the last Security Cabinet meeting where both Prime Minister Netanyahu and Ron Dermer, the who was a chief negotiator and regional affairs minister, talked about the fact that they're telling Chief of Staff Eyal Zamir that President Trump does not want an extended operation here. He wants something quick, and they're concerned if things stretch out, they're going to lose the backing of President Trump for the military operation. So I think these are significant comments by President Trump. He's turning focus back onto the hostages.
Now, Calev, I want to specifically play that soundbite that we actually heard President Trump say just the other day on Friday. Let's take a listen to it so our viewers can hear what we're talking about.
In Israel, families of hostages are opposed to the reoccupying of Gaza. Why is the U.S. still
Well, not
supporting
all of them. And you have to understand, I'm the one that got all of the hostages out. You got a lot of people out. If it wasn't for me, they wouldn't be out. I worked with Bibi and I worked with Steve Witkoff. But if it wasn't for me, you would have all these hostages would most likely be dead right now, every one of them. The situation has to end. It's extortion and it has to end. And we'll see what happens. I actually think they're safer in many ways if you went in and you really went in fast and you did it. And people can't forget October 7th, remember that. I'm friendly with all groups. You know, I'm very proud to say I got the hostages out. You have hundreds of people that are living now because of me. And now we have that final little group of people. And Hamas knows that if they give them, that's probably the end of their lives. So it's not easy to get. And I know if you're a parent, you just don't care. You want, I want my baby back. They want their babies back. They want their kids back. And I understand it. But I got them out and did a good job. And we're doing everything we can to get the hostages out.
Now, Calev, in that soundbite, we heard President Trump talk about his role in getting so many of these hostages out when he first came into office starting in January. Tell me what you make of what he said there to these reporters.
Again, very interesting. Focusing on the hostages and also was saying we need to see this thing end. I think all this is pointing to the fact that there's probably going to be sort of an accelerated timeline on this Gaza City operation show. Remember, originally, a few weeks ago, we were talking about something that would take several weeks to organize, for the IDF to call up the necessary troops. Some people have been saying that it really only started in earnest in October. But actually, what we're seeing now is the troops moving very quickly into certainly the outskirts areas of Gaza City. There was an excursion into Jabalia, which is just north of Gaza City, in order to make sure, I think, to seal off Gaza City. I think there's this urgency now on the IDF to get things done. There's another thing I think that is an interesting consequence of the Prime Minister Netanyahu for several weeks now has only talked about a complete deal. Something also President Trump also said. They don't want to accept a partial hostage deal. They want a full deal. And we heard Prime Minister Netanyahu reiterate that today publicly. But we're also getting these reports coming out now from Israeli sources saying a couple of the hostages are in life-threatening conditions. So if they're in life-threatening circumstances, that points to perhaps a shift back to acceptance of a partial hostage deal. Let's at least get those that are really maybe on the verge of death out now, and then continue negotiations and this Gaza operation simultaneously to see if we can get a full deal.
Right, and we know that the families of hostages are calling for a partial deal to be made. You know, basically they're asking for a deal to be made on anything that's on the table at this point in time. Originally, and at the beginning of all of this, we know that the families of hostages actually called for a comprehensive deal, wanting everyone home because they knew the risks that were involved in releasing hostages in partial waves and in phases. I want to ask you specifically, Prime Minister Netanyahu made comments at the end of the week saying that the military pressure on Hamas pretty much forced them to come back to the table. That's pretty much what he gathered with this new news that Hamas accepted this proposal on the table at this point in time. What do you make of something like this? And how far can this pressure militarily put on Hamas? What could they do that might surprise the rest of us, if that is even possible?
Well, there's no question. I mean, I think that fact's been proven. It was first of all, just the threat of the Gaza City operation that has made Hamas to modify its position somewhat. But yes, there are still points at which Israel and Hamas are not in agreement. The big one, of course, is the question of whether these negotiations would involve Israel withdrawing from Gaza and ending the offensive against Gaza. So that is why you see Prime Minister Netanyahu stressing that the Gaza operation will move forward even while negotiators are going to Cairo. What could come out? I mean, obviously, they could approach areas where, and this is what there's a big concern, areas where the Hamas is actually holding hostages. It may be the IDF knows some of these places, but has been concerned to actually push in too deep because, as we know, especially the case of what we're calling in Israel now the Beautiful Six, those 6 hostages that were killed, were executed in a tunnel because they felt the IDF troops were almost at the verge of rescuing them. So there's a kind of limit to how far this pressure is going to go. But again, I'm starting to wonder, despite what Prime Minister Netanyahu said today about a complete deal, if we are starting to shift more toward the likelihood of a partial deal. And as you said, the hostage families originally, also like the Prime Minister, like President Trump, were saying, no, we need a comprehensive deal now, starting to shift to the acceptance of a partial hostage deal.
Right. Anything they can do to get their loved ones out of captivity. They said they're willing to take any deal on the table. Calev and David, thank you so much for joining us today.
Always a pleasure, Shosh.
And starvation in Gaza. Israel rejects a UN claim that Israel is pushing back hard against, that a new UN report declaring famine in northern Gaza. The Prime Minister's office called the assessment, quote, modern day blood libel. The UN's integrated food security body, the IPC, estimates more than 500,000 Gazans are in famine conditions. Israel fiercely dismisses the findings here, saying more than 100,000 trucks of aid have entered Gaza since the beginning of the war, and that food prices have fallen in recent weeks. Now, the U.S. State Department also has casted doubt on the UN's data, pointing out the IPC's recently changing its definition of famine. Joining us now to discuss is Eitan Fischberger, researcher and writer. Thanks so much for being with us today. So, Eitan, you actually posted a thread on X giving a lot of context most people do not know about this IPC report. Tell us what you spoke about and what you posted.
Sure. So there are several issues with the report that have already been discussed, and that, what you mentioned about the changing of the definition. What I think is the most glaring error with the methodology of the report, if you want to call it that, if you even want to call it a report, is that, the IPC has this sort of like 15% malnutrition rate, that once the population in some territory hits 15% malnutrition, that's the trigger for a famine. Okay, except that's what they say, but that's not actually accurate, because the real trigger, it's only for a phase 4, which is emergency situation, but not for famine. In other words, they use this 15%, which is supposed to be a phase 4 trigger, and took it to mean that it's a phase 5 trigger. So that's one error. And the other error is that they actually, it actually never even reached 15% in Gaza City. So they're saying there's a 15% malnutrition rate in Gaza City, but it actually only reached 12% because the IPC for the month of July only relied on partial data. They only analyzed the information that they received from the Gaza Health Ministry, which is run by Hamas, and the various Hamas-run hospitals. They only got about 2 weeks worth of the data, not the full month. So that's one issue that people need to really understand, that there are these deep methodological flaws and data flaws inside the report itself. And another issue with the report is that we have evidence that at least one of the authors of the report is extremely biased against Israel. A gentleman named Andrew Seal, who's a professor out of London, who's named explicitly on the report. There's 5 or 6 authors that are named on page 1 in the acknowledgement section. And already in October of 2023, October 28th to be precise, he was already describing what Israel was doing as a quote-unquote genocide. He's on record defending the Houthi terror attacks in the Red Sea and on all the shipping lanes, saying that they're merely trying to enforce the genocide convention. He's saying that in 2018 he posted on X that the Nakba, quote unquote, is the It represents I'm quoting him directly now, the destruction of the state of Palestine by Jewish insurgents. He's been labeling Israel an apartheid state since 2018. He called for the U.S. to cut off aid from Israel weeks after the war began in November of 2023. So when you have all this put together, you have data flaws, methodology flaws, and flaws with the authors, to say the least, flaws. That creates a very disturbing picture of what this report actually is.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of limitations to that report. Also, to mention this geographic coverage of it, the report pretty much said they do not have complete data on some of the areas that they actually say they've covered, where there could be famine in that could spread to. I want to talk about the evidence and the reality that's on the ground in Gaza right now, and how as simple as the reality actually contradicts what this report says. For months now, since June, even before, there's been restaurants operating inside of Gaza City that post in real time the amount of food that they have in these restaurants. How can this report be published when there is evidence out there that actually corroborates what is happening on the ground in Gaza?
Sure. So, I mean, obviously, it's an issue we've been dealing with since October 7th and well before October 7th, the idea that what we're seeing out of Gaza isn't actually the truth. You have the entire media and journalistic apparatus there is dominated by Hamas and the other terror groups. So, the information, most of the information that we see pumping out of there is, manipulated by Hamas. We've seen a lot of hullabaloo about the fact that there's no international journalists in Gaza, and somehow that diminishes the integrity of the coverage, which first of all is dehumanizing to Palestinians, because they should be perfectly capable to you know do accurate media on their own. But the even when they're international journalists in Gaza, we've seen evidence of them manipulating having to abide by strict Hamas dictates. We have documents of Hamas telling international journalists and local journalists what they can say, what they can't say, what they can report on, what they can't report on. So that's in terms of why we're seeing this bizarre, disparate coverage of what we're seeing Gazans upload onto TikTok versus what the UN is saying. I'd also like to note that, there's what's amazing is that I crunched the numbers, and there has never been a conflict in the history of the modern world where more aid has entered into a single territory. The WFP, the World Food Program, has this basic ration where when you're in an emergency situation, every person is supposed to get a daily ration of 2,100 calories, which translates to about 500 grams, half a kilo of food. So 1.4 million tons of food has entered Gaza since October 7th, according to the Israeli military. And if you crunch the numbers, that should feed all of Gaza's 2.2 million residents for 1,312 days. That is an unbelievable amount of food. It's unfathomable, to be honest with you. And even when this aid is distributed, so then you ask, where's all the aid? If all this food has entered Gaza, where is it, right? Where is it? First of all, it's in the restaurants that we're seeing on TikTok. But the other location that it's in is that it's being diverted by armed gangs affiliated with Hamas or Hamas itself. We've all seen the videos of Hamas atop of aid trucks, diverting them to tunnels or wherever they hoard the food. We've also seen the UN's own dashboard say that, close to 90% of the aid trucks that are distributed in Gaza are diverted before they can get to their, destination. So it's just a gigantic mess of many different issues coalescing into one disaster.
Sure. And going back to that specific report, what I found fascinating is that the report didn't specifically say Israel in it. It also didn't say Hamas. It did mention, though, 87% of these UN aid trucks have been intercepted. And it actually said because of desperation, but it did not talk about the armed gangs that have taken this food that you mentioned, are associated with Hamas, the terror organization. We know Israel and the United States officials from both countries continue to say this aid is being stolen from from these gangs, from Hamas. It's being diverted for a specific reason, for their own benefit at this point in time of the war. But what would your rebuttal be back to anyone and to any journalists who do take the word of this report?
I would say that they should do their actual research and not just, act as the PR agency for the IPC. I mean, obviously, the IPC issuing a report like this is newsworthy in and of itself. I'm not going to deny that it's not newsworthy. But to exercise just a bit of critical thinking and saying to yourself, okay, well, who are the actors at play here? Who are the actors behind the report? Is it people like Andrew Neil who have a demonstrable history of let's call it anti-Israel bias, to say the least, and we're being generous here. Let's look at what his agenda is. Let's look at the methodological flaws that have been pointed out by various commentators and analysts and other media outlets that have pointed out these flaws. There was a report that recently came out from the Center for Medical Integrity the other day about the flaws with the IPC's analysis and its prior analyses. That's another thing. I would say exercise your critical thinking. If the IPC said back in March of 2024 that by May of 2024 there's going to be a famine in Gaza, and then there wasn't a famine, why is that? Maybe there's a flaw with their analysis. But I would tell the journalists in the West, just don't act like the IPC's PR agency. Do your jobs, scrutinize the data, and hopefully you'll see the truth.
Yeah, I think the biggest question and my takeaway from the reports, Eitan, is this famine widespread? It doesn't seem so. And if so, why has it not been calculated with pockets inside of Gaza? I think that's what we all want to know at this point in time. But thank you so much for joining us and for being with us today.
Thank you for having me.
And anti-terror raids in Judea and Samaria. Meanwhile, the IDF reports nearly 90 wanted men arrested in raids across the West Bank, including a senior operative in Jenin, happened over the weekend. The search continues for the gunmen who opened fire near the AD settlement on Thursday, wounding an Israeli. Troops sealed off the village, actually raiding homes and clearing vegetation to flush out terror cells. Take a listen to one of the officials had to say about thwarting this attack.
כל כפר וכל אויב צריך לדעת
I hear my...
שאם הם מוצאים פיגוע כנגד התושבים, הם ישלמו מחיר כבד. אנחנו נעשה מאמץ עכשיו במיקוד, וננצל גם את הסד"כ שקיבלנו, מיקוד על הכפר אל-מוע'ייר, שהוציא לא מעט פיגועים לאחרונה.
And an Israeli returned from Lebanon. This Israeli citizen was detained for about a year and has officially returned home. Saleh Abu Hussein was transferred back to Israel at one of the centers after months of secret negotiations with Red Cross mediation. He was received by the hostage official Gal Hirsch and reunited with his family after a medical check. The circumstances of his detention remain under investigation. And now moving on to Syria, it's been a few weeks since hostilities have settled down in the city of Sueda, a predominant Druze community there, where thousands of Druze were massacred, murdered by government forces and Bedouins last month. Joining us now to discuss is Lorena Khateeb, Israeli Druze journalist. Thanks so much for being with us, Lorena.
Thank you for having me, Shosh.
Talk to me about the developments that you are hearing about in Sueda, Syria right now.
Yeah, so the humanitarian situation in Sueda is still very bad. There are 700,000 people in Sueda with no supply route. There are still under siege, lacking access to water, food, basic needs for babies, and medicine for the sick. Only yesterday, a few hostages were released. The scenes were extremely difficult, to watch. Druze women were forced to wear the hijab, the head cover, against their will. This is just a glimpse of the extremist Islamist ideology of al-Julani and his regime that we are still witnessing in 2025. This is a direct attack, on the Druze community's honor, but a proud community with an unshakable values and rich history will not bow to terror.
So there was an exchange of hostages, people that were kidnapped. Who were they? Can you give us some detail about who they were? Were they women? Were they men? How many of these innocent people were given back yesterday?
Yes, there are a lot of people that are still being held in captivity, but yesterday around 80 people were released. I speak daily with Druze people from Syria, and also I have did like an interview with the people who no longer afraid to talk. They are worried because there are hundreds of people that are still being as being held as hostages. And the world, are not talking about the massacres and the war crimes that happened in Sweden. So we are their voice. We have to raise their voices and their stories and to speak about the massacres that happened there.
And on our screen right now is video of these protests, these massive protests in Judea, Syria that took place. We know hundreds of people came out to Judea there last week to demand for the right to self-determination for the Druze minority in Syria. Obviously a big show of support for Israel. Shocking sights to see these flags of Israel in Syria, but Israel was the country that came to their defense, actually striking targets as these massacres were ongoing against the Druze community. Now, Lorena, you mentioned that some of the women that were actually returned, they were kidnapped back in July. They were forced to wear hijabs on their head. Talk to me about why this would be something these women would be forced to wear.
Before we talk about the hijab, I have to speak about the support that we have seen in Sweden. The Arab world ignored the horrors that took place in Sweden in the last months, the murder of women and the rape of women. But suddenly they opened their eyes when the Israeli flag was raised, in Sweden. They acted as if that was the main problem in the whole Middle East. This is the hypocrisy that we face, in the last few years. So we also ask the world to look at what's happening in Sweden instead of blaming Israel, the only and the first country that have, protected the minorities in the Middle East, and especially in Sweden. And as I said before, I think that forcing a woman to wear a hijab, it's an act of violence against women. It's an act of trying, to force people to do things that they are not believing in, to force people to do something that they don't want to do. And this represents also, the ideology of Al-Julani. Al-Julani is known as, a terrorist. We cannot forget the dark history of Al-Julani. Recently, the Druze and Syria were accused also of, as I said before, of betrayal for raising the Israeli flag. But Al-Julani is trying to sign an agreement with the Israeli government, under the tables. And so the reality is very complicated for the Druze in Syria. It's very difficult, and we must continue to protect them.
So, Lorena, we're almost out of time, but my final question to you is, tell me what the situation in Sweden is like right now. Is food able to enter the city, and how are people picking up their lives?
Yes, so food is still not able to enter there. We here in Israel tried, to help them and to send them food. We have succeeded to enter few food, but it's not enough. There is also a lack of medicines and supplies for sick people. Only in Sweden there are around 9,000 people who have cancer that are being, dead just because they are not receiving their medicines. So we have, we urge the international community to get involved, to speak about what's happening in Sweden, and we call all, the human rights organizations to open and to move to the time that we have speak about an investigation and to open, a humanitarian aid coordinator to help our brothers and sisters in Syria.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Lorena. That is a wrap here on ILTV On The Hour. Thank you for joining us. Stay tuned for more updates as they continue to happen in real time.